Well, we seem to have reached our final keynote remarkably quickly, and I know it's been an eagerly awaited one, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Jerry Sheehan. Jerry is the Assistant Director for Scientific Data and Information at the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House just down the road. Prior to his appointment there, which was about a year ago, Jerry was responsible for open science policy at NLM, and he's going to talk to us about open access, data, science, and beyond. So over to you, Jerry.
Wow. Okay, well, thank you. Actually, I hope you'll have even more applause by the time I'm done than starting. But let me just say thank you to OASPA for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. It's actually an honor for me to be able to address this audience and provide closing remarks. This is a group that I think through the innovation it has brought to scholarly publishing and scholarly communications has done a lot to advance some of the same themes and initiatives that I've been working on from my time at NLM to my time now in OSTP to improve access to the results of scientific research. And I want to thank you for all that you've done in that regard. And we can continue, I hope, to look for ways to work together and collaboratively to make even further progress along those lines. I was asked to give you something of an update on what's happening in the US and abroad to some extent around these issues of open access, open data, open science. Within OSTP, we also work on things about open educational resources. I work on opening scientific collections, physical collections to a broader communities and for broader use and exploitation. So open is quite a big theme within the administration. If you have had anybody from the White House or related offices in front of you before, they've probably reminded you that from his first day in office, President Obama issued a memorandum, presidential memorandum, calling on all the agencies in the federal government to work together to create, and I'm going to quote, an unprecedented level of openness in government and establish a system of transparency, public participation, and collaboration. And it was not long after that an open government directive was issued and a plan for implementing this goal, this aspirational goal and vision of openness was issued. And in March 2009, not long after the inauguration, right, a memorandum on transparency and open government and another presidential memorandum on scientific integrity. And I'm going to just quote to you from that as well, because it stated in part that the public must be able to trust the science and the scientific process informing public policy decisions. And, coming back to one of the themes here, except for information that is properly restricted from disclosure, each agency should make available to the public the scientific or technological findings or conclusions considered or relied on in policy decisions. Those words from the presidential memorandum were then implemented in guidance that was issued to agency by the director of my agency, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, in December of 2010, who called on all the agencies to facilitate the free flow of scientific and technological information consistent with privacy and classification standards, and that agencies should expand and promote access to scientific and technical information by making it available in online and open formats. And it was these directives very early on in the Obama administration that set the stage for much of what I'm going to focus on in my remarks this afternoon, which I hope to show that open has encompassed a wide range of initiatives, access, data, science, and more, and has really set the stage for a lot of work going forward. Let me start with the first of these. I'm going to give you sort of a policymaker's view into openness, which means a lot of memorandum, a lot of declarations, and a lot of statements. And of course, to really make these meaningful, we have to turn them into action, into actions. And I'm going to give you some glimpse into what we've been doing across the federal science agencies to convert these policy statements into action and give you an update on where we stand in terms of implementing our efforts in this area. So the most prominent of these policies when it comes to open access, maybe the closest connected to what you have been discussing over the course of the last day and a half, has been the OSTP memorandum on what you could call open access, but we called it the Public Access Memorandum, which was issued in February of 2013, again by my boss, Dr. John Holdren, the Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and the Director of the OSTP. And this memorandum called on all of the federal science agencies that spend more than $100 million a year on research and development to develop plans for increasing the accessibility of the peer-reviewed scholarly publications and digital data resulting from their research. And it's probably worth keeping in mind, I know we have something of an international audience here today, that in the US, the science system and R&D funding is spread across a pretty wide number of agencies. I mean, more than 20 agencies meet the threshold of funding more than $100 million in research and development on an annual basis. So there are many different systems in place, there are agencies in place, cultures in place, and fields of science that are covered by these agencies. What I think has been consistent across them are the reasons for which OSTP and the administration issued this memorandum. To look at the directive here as simply trying to provide free access to journal articles and associated data is somewhat missing the point or missing the larger picture. In many ways, we see public access and open science as an enabler as much as it is an end in itself. The aim of these efforts has really been to increase the reach and the impact of federally funded research and development, to accelerate science and innovation and the application of science to national as well as global challenges. So we know that scientific research supported by the federal government as well as supported by other governments really catalyzes innovation and can help drive economic growth. We also know that the research that is funded by the government is intended to develop new knowledge and new insight that can be applied to advances in areas from health to energy, the environment, agriculture, and national security. And it's really these objectives that we're trying to achieve. We know that increased access to the results can make this information more accessible to the largest possible audience of potential users, essentially now anybody who has an internet connection. And one of the things we've learned over time is that innovation and the translation of research results doesn't just happen in certain particular research laboratories. It's not just at university research laboratories, it's in industry, it's in small businesses, it's entrepreneurs, it's people working in their garages. It's educators and students who have ideas. It's really the general public, especially the attentive general public. And by making information and data more accessible to this very broad community of potential users, we create even more opportunities for us to apply science to health, energy, environment, agriculture, national security, and to catalyze the innovative developments and the economic growth that we seek. We think these kinds of policies can also improve the efficiency of innovation, letting firms focus on the application of understanding and new knowledge to their new markets and new products and services, and the science system can continue to generate new knowledge. It may also create opportunities for new business opportunities and new markets to disseminate information and provide data curation and preservation services, both in the public and the private sectors. And we think as well, it helps increase the transparency and help maximize the accountability of the federal government and our federal research investments. But I think our real emphasis in doing this is on trying to improve the degree to which new science and new knowledge can be applied to national and global challenges. In approaching this problem, how do we increase access to the scholarly publications and digital data? We had to recognize that there are many agencies with many different missions, many different authorities, many different existing systems for doing it, and many different ways of relating to the communities that they fund, many of them conducting research themselves and being part of the research community. So rather than being very prescriptive in terms of how agencies should improve public access, what we did instead was we outlined a set of common objectives that all of the plans from the many agencies would have to meet and comply with. And I've listed some of them up here. When it comes to scholarly publications, the key elements are to enable the public to read, download, and analyze in digital form published scholarly literature. We want to ensure that a copy of the full text of any peer-reviewed publication is accessible not later than, as a guideline, not later than 12 months after the official date of publication, which means that public access to the full text can be achievable either through access to the final peer-reviewed manuscript or to the final published article. We want to ensure as well that the metadata, the citation information about those publications is available at the time of publication. So we know what's come out of the federal research funding as soon as it's come out. For digital data, the main objective is to maximize free access to the data that resulted from federally funded research while taking into account several limitations on that access, protecting privacy, confidentiality, certain proprietary interests in respecting intellectual property rights, as well as protecting national security. We also recognize that we need to balance the costs and benefits of data access and preservation. Some data may be more valuable, may be more reusable. It may be certain forms of a data that have a higher public or private value, and the costs of preserving them and making them accessible can differ. And we need to have that taken into account in agency plans and in our implementation of those plans. The real way in which this process is implemented in agencies is by a requirement for a data management plan, describing in a new research study what type of data are going to be collected, what standards does it adhere to, what are the plans for long-term preservation of that data, should it deserve long-term preservation, and what are the plans for providing access to that data. To ensure that those plans kind of meet the standard of the community and meet some standards of the government agencies as well. There is a requirement for these plans to be evaluated in the process. Do they meet the standard? Are they sufficient? Can we provide better feedback in terms of what would be an improved data management plan? I think there's an expectation as well that we didn't expect federal agencies to necessarily develop the infrastructure, especially for data themselves. Data are diverse, data are large, can be quite large in terms of volume, and we expect that, and we know that there are many other data repositories that may exist at institutions in certain research disciplines supported by private vendors as well that may be appropriate places to store digital data. And we want to give the agencies the flexibility to take advantage of those opportunities, as well as to sort of map out where there may be additional need for the agencies themselves to support data repositories. So let me give you a little sense as to where we currently stand. This memorandum came out just over about three and a half years ago. And I think we've made considerable progress over that time in moving from OSTP memorandum to agency plans and policies. Across the federal government, there are now 16 federal agencies that have completed their public access plans. These agencies cover 98% of the federal R&D budget in any given year. So it's a sizable number of agencies, and it's the very large chunk of the research that's been covered. All of these plans are available on their open government websites, and there are several organizations that have created listings, integrated listings of the policies with links out to them, including one by an interagency group that goes by the name CENDI, which is a group of science and technology information centers, and I think you have the URL up there as well. There are a few additional agencies that we're continuing to work with to bring their plans to closure, and I think they are making very good progress in their plans. We hope to be able to announce them very soon. I think what's also interesting is to note that several agencies and other organizations have voluntarily complied with the OSTP memo, also kind of resonating with the general principles of the memorandum. On the list, you'll see the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, agency that doesn't meet the $100 million per year threshold, but saw public access to its research publications and its data as being very integral to its mission of trying to help the nation prepare for emergency response. The Institute for Museum and Library Services has also developed a public access policy despite not funding $100 million of research in a year. And there are several other institutions that are quasi-government or that administer federal funds, even though they're not federal agencies, that have also voluntarily complied. On the slide, you'll see the Smithsonian Institution, which is a federal trust that administers federal funds. Also something called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI, which is a private organization that also administers funds in the health sciences, have developed public access plans very much in accordance with the objectives that the OSTP memo laid out. Implementation of these plans is also proceeding apace, and we're making very good progress. So the agencies with completed plans, and in fact, some agencies that haven't yet completed their plans, are moving into implementation. What this means is that for their intramural research, new projects need to develop data management plans, and any publications resulting from those projects will need to be publicly accessible in accordance with the policy. This also applies to their extramural, their funded research communities, contractors, grantees, researchers, and universities, who also now will be under obligations for newly funded research to provide data management plans, typically at the time of application, describing what they're going to do with the data. So that can be evaluated, whether in the peer review process or in a parallel evaluation process. And as well, requirements for them to make any publications accessible not later than 12 months after the official date of publication. At this point in time, 14 agencies require for all new research projects, intramural and extramural, that public access be provided to their publications in accordance with their policies. By October, there'll be 2 other agencies, the U.S. Geologic Survey and the Administration for Community Living within the Department of Health and Human Services, that will also be making that complete across their research portfolios. You can also find a more complete listing of the dates and the timelines on this CENDI website that I referred to. That's the policy implementation. There's also been considerable work in terms of technical implementation for providing access to these publications. There are now, I think each agency has identified and designated the repository into which publications must be deposited or through which they will be made accessible. Across 20+ agencies, there are about 9 different repositories that have been established, and these can fall into about 3 different categories. First is you'll see about 9 agencies making use of PubMed Central as the repository for their public access publications. This includes all of the agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the VA, the Veterans Administration, NIST, that's our National Institute for Standards and Technology, and the Department of Commerce, NASA, and the EPA. There are also agencies that have made use of other existing infrastructure that they had in place already. For example, the Department of Education with its ERIC system, which has been in place for decades. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, which has a system called STACS that has been in place for some time and is also well known within its research community. You'll see 2 other agencies have decided to collaborate with CDC, essentially using their STACS infrastructure and their own instantiations of it to make their publications accessible. That's NOAA and the Department of Transportation. Even the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, has had a development experience clearinghouse as a source of information on its projects that it funds, that it is now using as the repository for its public access publications. The third sort of category are those agencies that decided they needed to set up something new and something different as their repositories. And on the far right, you'll see the Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Defense, all of whom are using essentially infrastructure developed by the U.S. Department of Energy and its so-called PAGES system as a way of providing a catalog of publications and citation data for publications associated with both an agency-run archive of publications and with links out to published versions of those articles through a system called Chorus, which has been put together by a number of publishers. Maybe some in the room are also participants in that activity. The Department of Agriculture has also set up essentially a new system, PubAg, that will be the repository for its public access publications. In many cases, these repositories include collections that go beyond just their public access materials. This is consistent with their missions in many cases to collect, organize, and disseminate research publications and literature, different types of literature as well, beyond peer-reviewed publications, and make those available to their affected communities and stakeholder communities. We're now in a process, as these repositories have been launched and established, of trying to increase the coordination amongst agencies. If you want to, on the one hand, we have 22 agencies, and we do not have 22 repositories. We also do not have a single repository, for the very reasons that there are differences in the way agencies want to handle the systems they had in place and the relationships that they have with their communities. But we do want to simplify procedures for both those who want to search across content and those who might need to deposit or comply with multiple policies. So there's interagency coordination, I can tell you, that is happening now to try to figure out how best to do that, how to make these systems operate more as a federated network, and to provide integrated search across them. And I think you'll see continued improvements in that capability, as well as continued improvements in each of the underlying repositories over time. I think it's also worth pointing out that within the context of public access, that open access and open access publications are also playing a notable role. To date, across these various systems, many of which are only beginning to be populated by publications because the policies are only now going into place. They're affecting new research that's just been funded, for whom the publication may still be forthcoming. But many have set up starter sets, if you will, of publications based on their research to provide a collection of articles for people to begin to use and to test out the capabilities of the systems. At present, there are about 4.1 million articles contained in these various, I'll say, peer-reviewed publications that are made accessible via these various systems. The vast majority, I think now 4 million of those articles, coming from PubMed Central itself. For now, as I said, most of the other agencies are really just getting started, but they've got about a potential for about another 100,000 articles per year when these policies are fully in place. And over time, we expect that we'll be making roughly 200,000 or so articles per year accessible through these, under the public access policies, with access, again, up to 12 months after the date of publication. I think it's worth noting that to date, it's hard to say how much of the content in many of these repositories will be open access. We have some early estimates, though. Within the Department of Energy, they estimate that about 20% of the content is coming from open access articles, whether those are from open access journals or from publications in hybrid journals. A quick analysis of the content in PubMed Central showed that for publications in 2015 that were subject to the public access policy, about 30% of them came from open access journals, about 26,000 out of the 85,000 articles from 2015. The availability of these open access articles in these repositories, we think, can help generate even additional benefits from public access to the extent that they allow rights for additional reuse beyond reading and downloading. Text mining, for example, of this content can help unlock even more of the capability within them by allowing people to find and search even more easily for content that's going to be relevant to their research studies, and helping them make connections between and across and among publications that may be in various repositories. NIH made an announcement several months ago now that it has begun to make part of the PMC content available in easily accessible formats that facilitate text mining. This includes the open access subset of PubMed Central, as well as author manuscripts that have been submitted into the system. Altogether, if we look at the open access subset for peer-reviewed publications, and again, looking at what was submitted under the NIH public access policy in 2015, of the 85,000 publications, more than 67,000 of those could be accessible for text mining. It's about 80% of the total, either because they're open access publications or because they're author manuscripts. Let me say another word about data management. Agencies are implementing their policies now and their requirements for data management policies across their funded portfolios. At present, about 10 agencies now require data management plans for all of the new research that they fund, intramural and extramural. This includes the largest funding agencies like NSF, DOE, some other smaller ones like the US Department of Transportation. And 6 additional agencies have begun phasing in these requirements across their research portfolios, NIH being the most notable example there, as well as the Department of Education. For data, as we said, many of the agencies have in place data infrastructure that can handle the data for a percentage of the research that they fund, for particular types of data, whether it be genomic data or it be Earth observation data from NOAA or even from the US Geological Survey. Many of them now are looking into new solutions for how to improve data access, especially for data that's generated by the outside extramurally funded research community. For data that's generated by the agencies themselves, there's even more policy in place. Shortly after the public access memo was issued, the White House also issued a memo and an executive order on open data, on making open and machine readable the new default for government information. This requires agencies to make data that they collect or manage by default open and accessible to the public, and requiring them to collect or create information in a way that supports downstream information processing and dissemination using machine-readable formats, open formats, and data standards, and common core and extensible metadata to support cataloging and discovery. Since 2009, when about 50 data sets were put in a fledgling data.gov repository, there are now 200,000 data sets that are available for public use through data.gov, spanning the range from education data sets that are now helping families and students evaluate college choices, data on housing that's helping with the implementation of the Fair Housing Act by helping find through a fair housing assessment tool, and very scientific data, climate data. In 2014, the president announced a climate data initiative, which is trying to make freely available climate-relevant data of resources available to stimulate innovation and private sector entrepreneurship in support of climate change and preparedness. There are now hundreds of federal data sets related to climate that are being made accessible. We're also trying to gather and learn some of the lessons from data and our data release activities to date. Just next week, there will be a major open data summit taking place here in Washington on Wednesday that will provide an opportunity to share lessons learned, highlight new solutions that have been developed, and make further progress in embedding open data principles across federal agencies. We've also made progress in unleashing and unlocking the potential of this data to stimulate innovation through yes, another memo and another policy directive on citizen science and crowdsourcing. This memorandum attempts to use these tools of citizen science, getting more citizens engaged in the collection of data, and crowdsourcing techniques, typically through challenges that are publicly announced and allow the public to participate in developing solutions to critical problems. These are now available. These challenges are listed in a new resource called challenge.gov. And over the course of the last 2 years or a year and a half since this initiative was put in place, several hundred new challenges have been issued. More than 80 federal agencies have engaged some 250,000 Americans in 700 challenges, ranging from addressing problems in fighting Ebola to decreasing the cost of solar energy and to blocking illegal robocalls. Companies then have made more than $200 million available to entrepreneurs and innovators, and this has led to the formation of more than 275 startup companies and 1,000 new jobs. We've also begun to see how open science is going global. As you all know through your own research efforts, you're probably engaging with researchers in other countries, other institutions that are developing public and open access policies. Over the course of just the last year, in 3 major international fora, issues of open science, particularly related to making increased access to publications and associated research data from publicly funded research more accessible, have gotten high visibility and commitments from countries around the world. At an OECD-led science and technology ministerial meeting that took place about a year ago in Daejeon, Korea, which brought together leaders from more than the 34 OECD member countries, all agreed that science, technology, and innovation are being revolutionized by new technologies and increasingly reliant on open access and to scientific data and publications. They committed themselves to new work within the OECD to share good practices for how best to provide open access and how to work together to develop infrastructure for providing support, especially for data. Earlier this spring, in May, at a G7 meeting, which brings together the leaders of the science and technology leaders from the 7 leading industrialized countries, also acknowledged that open science is changing the way that science, research, and development is being undertaken. They agreed that open science would be a cross-cutting theme of their discussions, as well as that it would emerge in virtually all of the other topic areas in which they were addressing, from ocean science to promoting healthy and active aging, as well as in energy and in something called inclusive innovation, which is trying to bring innovation to lesser developed countries, as well as ensure that the full population of even developed countries is engaged in innovation. They have also agreed to set up an international working group that will share good practice on open science principles and practices, look at how we overcome barriers associated with the need for data infrastructure, the need for skills, as well as creating incentives for open science practice, incentives for sharing data. Just earlier this month, the G20 leaders in Hangzhou, China, which included President Obama and other G20 leaders, also recognized in their final communique, made a commitment to support appropriate efforts to promote open science and facilitate appropriate access to publicly funded research results on findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, or the so-called FAIR principles, and are also looking at now how to follow up those commitments with action. I think what all of this has meant to us in OSTP and in the administration is that we've made great success in establishing openness as a basic premise within federally funded science, within openness to federally funded research data, and in developing new tools to provide even greater use of that open data to drive innovation. Earlier this summer, to celebrate Dr. Holdren's tenure as the longest-serving presidential science advisor, OSTP issued something called an impact report that listed 100 accomplishments in science and technology through the Obama administration. Number 12 on that list was that we had made, at that time, more than 180,000 federal data sets and collections available to students, entrepreneurs, and the public. Number 13, we opened up federally funded research data and publications through our open science and public access activities. Number 14, harnessed American ingenuity through increased use of incentive prizes through open innovation. And number 15 was extended opportunities for citizen science and crowdsourcing, another way of advancing open innovation. The National Innovation Strategy that was issued a year ago puts all of these in context. In fact, it was number 12 on the list as an accomplishment. And elevating transparency, openness, and scientific integrity was number 4 on the list. All of these now are seen as significant accomplishments of the Obama administration, and I think they really have reflected a sea change in the way we approach science and we approach technology development and innovation. We recognize that there's a lot more to do. We've all been instructed that we are racing and sprinting through the finish line over the next several months to try to make further progress and further advances in open access and open science. We're looking at ways of increasing and accelerating access to results. We have questions about other kinds of research and scientific data outputs that might be worth trying to increase accessibility of. We know there are many, many questions about infrastructure and the sustainability of infrastructure, especially for data, and the questions of cultural change and attribution that need to be addressed. I would like to come here with answers for you on how we could address all those challenges, but I think what I really want to do is come here and ask for your help and your questions and your suggestions for how we best move forward on them. There's much left to do, much work to be done, and we want to hurry to get as much of it integrated into the fabric of our science and technology system as we can. So I thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I think we've left some time for questions and discussions, and I look forward to the exchange. So thank you.
For people to get their ideas together, I wonder if I can take Chair's privilege and say at one point early in your talk, you said that a large part of these initiatives was designed to re-inspire public trust in science and in how science is used to apply to policy. Have you seen anything coming through the work so far that indicates that objective might be underway?
Well, I think to the extent that we've had a relatively, I don't want to say less controversial, I think there has been much more greater public engagement in our scientific activities, engagement of the private sector, as well as the federal scientific community. We held a workshop very recently on scientific integrity policies. And it was interesting in that context to note the number of agencies that were looking at issues of scientific integrity and their relationship to the progress they had made in open science and open data by making more clear to the public what it is the agencies had been funding, giving them greater confidence in the validity of the published research results because they were accessible as well as the underlying data. So I think we see this is another theme that can be woven into the open science fabric and is certainly providing support for all of our efforts around increasing scientific integrity.
And another one, I know themes that some of us have discussed earlier this week around incentives, which you started to come to right at the end of your talk. Has OSTP started to give any thought to incentives that would encourage more open practices among researchers?
So I know there's been quite a bit of discussion of incentives kind of across the board, and I guess the way I would say we've been thinking of them is almost three different steps. This is especially the case, I'll say, thinking along the lines of data and data access, where I think the first step is having the technical piece in place. What are the digital data object identifiers and so forth that you can use to cite the reuse of data or data set that you've reused. The second is sort of the practice of data citation in terms of making the data a standard piece of perhaps a bibliography or reference list or another way to develop the practice of citing your data in papers. And the third is where the most challenge is about how do we ensure that those citations are reflected and are actually considered within decisions that make important decisions of relevance to the scientific research community. It's discussion to the extent to which those can be included as criteria in grant applications and considerations, whether they get considered in terms of hiring and promotion decisions within the federal government as well. I think a lot of the discussion around attribution is how do these factor into promotion and tenure decisions in universities. And I think that's where, again, we probably have a shared interest among this audience in terms of making progress there and bringing about the cultural change that can affect that. We can certainly take steps to make sure that there's at least an opportunity to put that sort of information forward for other people to consider as we're also trying to change the culture and the attitude and evaluation criteria that are used.
Thank you for that overview, and it's very apparent to me anyway that the government has been relatively effective at executing on its own mandate in this regard. So as we move forward as a government, what other priorities are queuing up after open? What types of things are on the horizon to be tackled that are being perceived that are a priority?
Well, I think right now much of the priority is sort of bringing a number of administration initiatives to the point that they're embedded in the fabric of the way that the government operates. Again, my point here in terms of making open science embedded in the policies and practices of federal agencies, taking open data and finding approaches through the summit that will take place next week to bring, to bring that to the point that it can also move through a transition in administrations. There have been a large number of other initiatives within OSTP and within the administration around science and technology, from improving computer science instruction to improving STEM instruction across the board and increasing diversity in the STEM workforce. Those have all been high priorities. There's been recently launched initiatives around artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is also associated with and makes use of a lot of the open data and scientific resources that we've been trying to unveil through our public access initiatives, as well as making pushes in terms of a national microbiome initiative to advance our understanding of the microbiome across different domains, from the environment to the human health to others. I think what's been interesting is the number of these different domains and initiatives that in some way come back and touch on data. And just as we are starting to ask scientists to develop data management plans for their research portfolios, there's the question of how we ensure that even in major initiatives through government and other organizations, that we ensure that data is a component of those initiatives. You've heard that probably in the Vice President's remarks about the cancer moonshot. How do we break down barriers and silos in data and data access for what is largely a research initiative, but recognizing the importance of increased access to data and information in that context.
One of the major themes that came over from your talk was that the government education for openness and transparency and creation of knowledge, both to enable new scientific questions to be addressed and as an environment. Is there any appetite in the administration to go beyond public access policies to enable real reuse through different types of licensing? Are federal agencies interested in applying licenses that can really enable reuse?
I think this is, so some of that was envisaged, if you will, in the OSTP memo about the automated processing and so forth of manuscripts and the accessibility of data. I think there's considerable interest, continues to be considerable interest in terms of how we move forward to sort of unlock content in ways that we can make more use of it. That's why I highlight the NIH initiative in terms of making data more machine processable. Other agencies are right now trying to get their basic systems in place, and we're having a number of discussions about what can be next and what should be next, and that's certainly a topic under discussion and consideration right now. And I even welcome suggestions about how you best go about doing that. How do we both accelerate access, and how do we make that access more productive and meaningful?
One last question.
Hi, Jerry. Andrew Tian with Wiley. First, I want to thank you for all of your efforts and efforts of OSTP colleagues on the public access, and as a chorus board member, I've really appreciated working with OSTP and the agencies. So two short questions. I think first, related to the end of the administration, which I personally am bemoaning, and I'm sure many of us are quite concerned for implications for science under the next government, a next government. But what box would you like to check related to public access outside of getting the final agency plans out the door? And is there something that publishers can be doing? And then the second question is the interagency pain points that are emerging and will continue and will require all of us to kind of get in it together. Can you elaborate on what some of those are? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me take your first in terms of what we'd like to check the box and then say we've accomplished. I think we want to move from beyond the planning to having the implementation phases well enough along that we know that they will have continuation right into a new administration, and let's hope far, far beyond that. So even the agencies that have finished their plans still have work to do in terms of getting the implementation stage done, getting language into their contract and grant mechanisms, and in different ways of putting that into their intramural processes as well. I think I'm quite pleased with the fact that we now have the repositories identified. And agencies now have the systems up and running, and we're starting to not only make heavy use of some of those, but kicking the tires of the others and understanding how they work and how they can be improved. And I think that, those are some of the issues that are coming out of the interagency discussions too. A lot of it really right now is probably less about identifying pain points than it is about trying to share good lessons and good practices, because many agencies, not only do their systems differ, sometimes the way that manuscripts get submitted to them differ. Different forms of collaboration with the publishing community, whether it's through Chorus, as you're very familiar with, or whether it's through publisher agreements like the NIH has set up with PubMed Central. There are a number of different models that are being used, and some agencies that are still trying to figure out which would be most appropriate for them to help, I'll say, ease the burden on submission by investigators. also in terms of trying to understand better how to monitor compliance. How do we know what the universe is of publications that have come out of funded research? Agencies, again, have different capabilities in place for doing that, depending on some of their grant management systems and other information systems they have, and are thinking through how they can improve those, how they can work with other institutions, with each other, and with private sector groups as well, to help improve that type of monitoring. And I think that's one of the areas around which we have quite a bit of conversation now. I think it would be fair to say, too, that even among agencies that have been sort of the slowest to come along in getting their public access policies together, whether it's on the publication side or on the data side, I'd have to say there's been a lot of positive reinforcement of it. I think there's even more buy-in now than there was at the beginning when they were sort of facing, the mountain of policy development that needed to go forward, that when they needed to think through the technical development that needed to take place. And I think they have begun to see, both on the publication side and on the data side, the benefits of these types of activities, whether it's been through their success in using some of this for crowdsourcing and other types of initiatives. Even some agencies who are saying on the data side, we have a much better understanding for the kinds of work that are being done by our funded investigators than we ever had before, because we didn't know about the data and the data management. So I think there are many areas in which we're trying to look for ways to leverage good practice and share good lessons across the agencies, as well as finding ways then to engage with non-federal partners. And I think now is about as good a time as any to try to increase that type of collaboration.
Fantastic. Great note to end on. Jerry, thank you very much.
All right.